delay.
Yeah, right. Yeah, there's a lot of you don't know what to believe, right? In that scenario, even if the power got back on, the grid is still so vulnerable that, as he was saying, it still continues to have blackouts. So it's like these little band-aids that were put all over the island. Let's just connect you back on, but then it might go off again. So the entire infrastructure needs to be redone, and I would propose some type of renewable sources, but again, that's difficult to do on an entire island of 3.4 million people. And as he said, there's actually over 5 million Boricuas on the mainland. So there's more on the mainland than there is on the island. And there was an exodus of people coming. There was an extreme humanitarian and economic crisis that was happening in Puerto Rico before Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Maria hit the island, because let's not forget that Irma hit first, and then Hurricane Maria came and completely devastated the entire island. Hospitals weren't able to have power. Water wasn't able, people didn't have water, people were drinking water from the streets, gas lines to try to get gas for the very few people that even had generators. And I remember speaking to my uncle, who, by the way, got power on New Year's Eve. 3 months later, couldn't get to a farm that we have that is usually about an hour away, and he said it took him 8 hours or more just to be able to get there to figure out what the destruction was. Schools were closed down, and I'm sure he'll speak to Philip's daughter was literally going to class without power. And so this is the reality. And so I will agree with you that Hurricane Maria, as horrible as it is and was and continues to be, allowed so many people to see the truth of what is happening in Puerto Rico. And unfortunately, it's these devastating moments that we suffer where people then move to action. I mean, I can use a current scenario such as the Parkland shooting that has now created this entire march, for our lives, right? And so it's these horrible things that then people's eyes get awakened, and I hope that today you continue to learn more about what is going on and get engaged and recognize that your voice is powerful and that we need your help. On here in the mainland is where we can create the most change, because you have the ability to vote and the people on the island do not. They have no representation whatsoever. So I'm excited to continue talking about this.
Well, when I've been invited to panels in the past, it's always hard to be third on the panel because pretty much everybody said everything I was going to say. But first of all, I want to thank the University School of Law Administration for holding this event, because as Josie mentioned, it's really important to have these type of events to talk about Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has been under the shadows for so many years, and as Josie mentioned, sometimes it's required or it's beneficial in a way, ironically, that disasters happen, is it sheds light on something that otherwise people would have no idea about. In terms of Puerto Rico, not only in terms of the response to Puerto Rico's hurricane disaster, but all the intrinsicies in terms of Puerto Rico, whether it be its political status, whether it be its economic crisis, which already existed before the hurricane. Puerto Rico was already in a very dire situation. And if it wasn't because of the unfortunate situation with the hurricane, most mainstream Americans would, quite frankly, not know anything about Puerto Rico or don't care. There's an enormous amount of American citizens who have no idea that Puerto Rico was a U.S. territory. They always thought it was some foreign nation. So all these things that happen are beneficial and positive in the way that it sheds light on Puerto Rico's situation. In my case, having grown up there, my dad was in the military. I lived in Puerto Rico for like 14 years. I went to my first year of law school there, and then I transferred over here. It was really hard to watch on TV the disaster, because having lived there and worked in the government there, I already knew how vulnerable the infrastructure was. And I remember thinking to myself when I worked in the Department of State, good Lord, if something happens, this is not going to hold up. And when I saw that Category 5 heading towards Puerto Rico, I'm like, oh, here we go. And it happened. And Puerto Rico, to this very day, as the panelists have mentioned, there's a majority of the sectors who don't have power. And although we have statistics, they're not reliable in a sense. Because I don't know how many here are fans of the best TV show, in my opinion, in history, The Wire. Anybody seen it? You know, in The Wire, there's a lot of scenes where the cops skew the statistics, right, the data. It happens everywhere. It happens in Puerto Rico. It happens everywhere. So, you know, there's political reasons behind it. There's public policy reasons behind it. So we may never know. We may have to rely on independent organizations who are currently investigating Puerto Rico. Numerous journalistic organizations and entities are investigating as well, and the information is trickling down. And so far, the information is totally the opposite from what the government is informing. So we remain positive in terms of rebuilding, creating a permanent infrastructure in Puerto Rico that is self-sufficient. And I'm sure we may talk about this later on in the panel, but President Bill Clinton has on numerous occasions expressed that Puerto Rico can be the mecca of renewable sources of energy, solar energy. The island has solar, wind. It has everything it needs to be completely self-sufficient, but there are powers to be that don't want that to happen. So, but as my fellow panelists mentioned, you all have a very important stake in this. You can actually generate change because, as opposed to Puerto Rico, the 3.5 million American citizens of Puerto Rico do not have the power to vote. And that's an entirely different issue. We can have an entirely other conference about it. But you have the ability to keep Puerto Rico up front and center and make sure that the American citizens in Puerto Rico are treated equally with the rest of the United States.
Philip, could I follow up on one of the things you mentioned, that the statistics or information coming from the government of Puerto Rico is not matching up with what's coming out of various organizations, international organizations? What is that disparity?
Well, the highest disparity is the death count. Because obviously that's the one that represents the highest political capital. You know, every administration wants to expose that they're efficient, that they avoided and prevented deaths, they did the right thing. And that's not only in Puerto Rico, you see that everywhere. But when President Trump arrived to Puerto Rico and he was seated alongside with the governor of Puerto Rico, they alleged the death count was around 8, 7. And at that very time, these independent organizations revealed that it was actually almost triple that. So that information is trickling out, and you see the inconsistencies. But I think that's why it's so important for non-politicians, independent organizations, concerned citizens, academics like yourself and future attorneys. I think that's the responsibility of all those people I just mentioned to shed light. Because sometimes within the political system, we all know how controlling that can be, and it has been difficult. So.
Yes, please.
So he's correct, and now the statistics I think says that there's about 60 that have died, but there's a Center for Investigative Reporting that has it calculated near the 1,000 mark, and so which would be somewhat equivalent to Hurricane Katrina, where President Trump kind of did a comparative analysis and saying that, oh, you're lucky that this wasn't a disaster like Hurricane Katrina. So currently, because there's been a lot of pressure politically, they are doing an independent study. They're hiring George Washington University to do an independent study in regards to the death count, where they're paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to do this study, and they said it's going to take about a year or so. And a lot of times, that is because in a year from now, this will just all be brushed under the rug. One news outlet will release that number, and it won't be, it will be somewhat diluted right at that point, because everyone will be now moved on to different things that they care about. And so also I think in terms of the power, saying it's only 11 or 12%, but as we mentioned, there's still all of these blackouts, so it's not a really accurate reporting. My father actually lived in Utuado before he moved here recently, and tells me that he still can't get in contact with some people. There are still so many places within Utuado, because Puerto Rico has, it's got the beach, it's got mountains, it even has desert, right? So the entire island has all of these very, very different topography, and there's still places in Utuado where people can't even get to, right? So how did the supplies get over there? And that's where it's really important to think about innovation and technology as to how, moving forward in the future, we can get supplies to these, very isolated communities. And if you had a comment on that as well.
Yeah, I actually have a few on this issue. So, when we created the coalition as it developed, let me put it that way, as the coalition developed that was putting the aid on the ground, one of our plans, we created a plan. One of the plans was one of our coalition members, Allison Thompson to be specific, led a team over to the island. While we did the logistics on the mainland, she went over and on multiple trips, literally went to every municipality on the island. Talked to all of the alphabet soup agencies, talked to all the local mayors when it was applicable, visited the towns. Quick story, we were looking to get aid in any way possible. We were chasing planes, we were chasing yachts, because the port was locked down, which I'll get to. So we had somebody on the ground in Ponce because we wanted to see if the cranes were available, because we were looking at getting a barge to send containers over, and we needed a way to get it off the ship, of course. So Ponce has 3 cranes installed. 2 of them were busted. One of them, the main one, had never, ever been turned on in the 2 years that it had been there. I visited a school in Laris that was being used as an, I hate the word refugee, evacuee center, or whatever you want to call it. But the school had been closed for 4 years. It wasn't like the school was open and they created this situation. I visited the only school on the island that has solar power in Aguadilla, down the street from the airport. They luckily had gas. Now, their power didn't work because they were tied to the grid instead of being off the grid, which is the way I prefer solar, personally. But they were feeding the DEA, Homeland Security, NASA. Aguadilla Airport is the backup airstrip for the shuttle program in case of emergency, for example. They always have a very strong presence. They could not get help either. We were in a warehouse in Windward, Miami, and the DEA was standing behind me while I was being broadcast on the news, picking up aid because they were taking a private plane over to the island to get to their family. That's how bad it was on the island. But to get back to what you were saying, we have been asked, along with other nonprofits, to help do the information gathering because the government has never, ever either been able to, done it, did it right, as my fellow panelists have mentioned. So we went about because we wanted to know, as we developed, we were getting aid from all over the country. So our plan was to find out the most distressed areas and supply aid to them in that order. So the storm went from the southeast corner of the island to the northwest. It actually hit the whole island. It doesn't really matter what the direction was. So we visited areas to find out where there was no power still, where there was no water, who has the most distress, focusing on the elderly and the children, etc. I mean, we sent everything, food, medical, water, whatever, everything that was we would gather, we sent over there. So we were able to get the intel, and there's just no truth coming out of there. And I really think it's because of the infrastructure. You know better. I didn't. My father grew up there. I didn't. But you know how corrupt it is from the top to bottom, just in places. I mean, you just can't, like, this person's corrupt. It's just all over the place. And San Sebastian decentralized. They had the money. So they did their own grid in town, and they have 100% power. They had it for months. When I was there in January, actually, it was getting to be 100%. That's the way. The information has to come from the communities. It has to be decentralized because they can't do it. The two biggest generators on the island were destroyed. They said they were going to have power in December. It takes 3 months just to take them apart, to fix them. And no one talked about that. And I'll make one last comment because this is a law school, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to come here so bad. And I'm on the Environmental Justice Committee. Anyway, one of the first things I did personally was to reach out to the Florida bar and the Puerto Rico bar because I wanted them to walk into court and sue FEMA for the blockade that they had put up on the island and the qualifications that they were telling people you had to do in order to get aid over to the island in the country. It was literally absurd. The very first thing that they told Senator Nelson in writing that was forwarded to me by his chief of staff was in order to get aid to the island, you had to tell FEMA what the purpose of the aid was. Let that sink in, advocates. What the purpose of relief aid was that you were sending to the island before you, and that was just number 1 of 5. In order, yes, thank you for the look, because that's what comes out of my mind. That's exactly right. This is the lunacy that was going on. And as an advocate, we can't let that stuff happen. I don't care about arguing with people in the middle of a crisis. I've been responding to disasters since Hurricane Andrew. I care about solutions. But we need to hold them accountable for the next time, which I know we're talking about, what to do for the next time. And please remember, find out why we can't get something done and stop it as advocates, please.
Could I follow? Oh,
real quick, sorry, because I might not pass it about to you, but part of the frustration was sending supplies, not hearing from no one, UPS not giving us any answers. You know, our families, they don't have communications. So I know Barry was, I don't know what's going on, but can you give us information if you're going there? Can we still give you things to send? Because I haven't heard anything, and you say you're on the ground giving us supplies.
Yeah, we sent 106 containers to the Caribbean. 86 of them went to Puerto Rico. 55 plane loads of items before we were able to come up with a shipping plan. All of this was paid for by donation. Right. Bethany Frankel, who is our main, who's a marvelous human being, the reality star. I hate reality TV. Watch Bethany, please. Support Bethany. She's the real deal when it comes to helping. So it was her efforts, along with our efforts, along with our coalition, that paid for everything. The government didn't give us any help. We didn't even talk to them after like the first 5 minutes when they were doing all this. So we came up with a plan, and donations is what paid for it. Yes, we are still, now I'm focusing more on rebuild, installing wells, as I mentioned. We're getting ready to start another one in Rio Grande, doing solar microgrids, micro manufacturing, things like that to help the economy and people getting stuff. But yes, ideally we will still take stuff because the island is in need, and it's just a matter of getting funding to send it.
Do we have like a link or something? Because
WeDoBetter.org.
Yeah, better.org.
We do better, and that means we do better.org. Just reach out to me.
Because no UPS, we don't know what's happening to these days.
so let's talk about that for a second. That you were talking about, Robert, the infrastructure on the island. So the panels made it very clear, it's unanimous, the infrastructure on the island was very weak to begin with. I'm going to venture a guess that there was not a sufficient hurricane plan in effect to address a hurricane of this level. Would that be accurate? So my question is, what is being installed now? Is the infrastructure being improved upon, or is it just a Band-Aid on the previous substandard infrastructure? And as a follow-up to that, have new plans for international aid, for on-island recovery been put into place for when a hurricane inevitably hits again? So, two-part question. Is the infrastructure being improved? And is a newer, better plan being put into place to address the next crisis?
Sure, I'll start. As far as I know, no, there's not a specific plan. for, plans are extremely important. Here in Florida, we don't even have a climate change plan, right? We don't have an action plan. And it's better to be proactive versus reactive. And so all of this was a reaction, a very slow moving reaction, which is still not even providing the amount of solutions. I think it's important to know some stats about Puerto Rico. 46%, almost half of the island is in poverty. That's double than the highest poverty rate of any state, Mississippi being the highest rate of poverty at 21.5%. So you have the island had claimed bankruptcy and was that's a whole, as Philip said, that's a whole nother conference as a whole. But there's no money. There's no money, and then the United States government isn't helping in that regard. In terms of international aid, because Puerto Rico is a territory or colony of the United States, the UN can't provide international aid. It has to be the United States, right? So it's like stuck between a rock and a hard place in terms of being able to move forward. And so a lot of, you're absolutely right, Karen, they are Band-Aid solutions, right? And they're not getting to the root source. There's a lot of discussion right now in terms of privatization of the well, actually they did just privatize like the electric power company, and when that happens, that's, the people are suffering because of that. And you're absolutely right, it has to be the communities and these off-grid kind of solutions so that they can really have sustainable development and have sustainability where you have people, planet, and profit, and working together, not just focusing on the profit being the priority over the people and the planet. And it was Sister Pat that told me many years ago that, and something I've now advocated for and kept to heart and teach all of my students that, the environment is the most important because that's how we operate, right? We as human beings need the environment to survive in order for us to take a breath and have a drink of water, right? And all of industry and how we power ourselves and how we run corporations is all through natural resources as well. So if we don't have that kind of mentality to begin with, then we're not gonna get the kind of sustainable development that we need in order for Puerto Rico to thrive to begin with. You wanna take it? And then we'll
I want to add a little bit to that. One of the problems that Puerto Rico is confronting as well is with something called disaster capitalism. You have a lot of companies swimming in, trying to make a quick buck. There was a huge controversy with a company based out of Montana. I believe it was Montana. Whitefish Energy. When they looked up the corporation's place of headquarters, the place of business, and corporation, it was a house in Montana. And they were charging millions and millions of dollars to do something that could easily be done in Puerto Rico. So it was cosmetic, and they were trying to make a quick buck, which has been Puerto Rico's story for almost more than a century. And we'll probably need another conference for that, but Puerto Rico's been exploited by corporations for over a century. So that's another obstacle and difficulty Puerto Rico's facing is receiving aid, but then you have to be on the defensive. Wait a minute, are you really here to help, or are you going to come here to make money? Or you're just going to put a patch and charge millions of dollars and then disappear, which is what happened with Whitefish. Fortunately, it was all over the news on CNN. They were exposed. The Puerto Rico government had to cancel their contract, but slowly but surely other companies are creeping in quietly. So that's another obstacle we have, as Josie mentioned. Greed is something very unfortunate in this world, in our society, where people are willing to make a quick buck at the expense of the poor. Oh, also, thanks for reminding me that. As I mentioned, President Clinton has mentioned Puerto Rico as a potential mecca of renewable energy and solar. So solar companies have come to Puerto Rico, and even Elon Musk came and offered to help. And what did the Puerto Rican government do and the federal government do? They're pushing for a solar tax. So if a citizen in Puerto Rico wants to acquire solar equipment for their house, they're going to get taxed on it. So it's like this never-ending mechanism of making it very hard for people to correct things that are wrong, all because the powers to be are threatened by reform and by change. So that's something that I've always believed that the people directly have to advocate and keep Puerto Rico in the light. Because if not, the powers to be, they benefit from keeping stuff in the shadows. We were listening to a podcast there, so you're talking about that. The more quiet you are, the happier they are. So I invite each and every one of you to speak up.
There's a question.
Somebody over.
In terms of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, one of the things the panel should know is that Barry University's physician assistance program operated in St. Croix, and we actually had students providing healthcare aid on all of the islands. That, of course, is all wiped out and devastated, and at this juncture, Barry has no plans to go back to the islands because of the support system. But as an economist myself, two of the problems I see with Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, specifically with Puerto Rico, is statehood has gone back and forth about whether statehood is wanted or not wanted. And until there is a decision to change from the people, from the groundswell up, that's never going to happen. In addition to that, the amount of debt that the island carries and hasn't been forgiven. You know, we've treated third world countries better than we've treated Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands for years. But again, it's because there's been no consistency out of the bottom up. And so the organizations that you're all working with and connect with, is there any change to go forward? You know, is there any thought been given to what statehood, or where does that stand?
Well, let me first chime in on the last question, and we can cover that for you, please, because that is a very important subject as well. Statehood is a big part of what's been going on in Puerto Rico for decades. I grew up in New York City, and that was in our papers the entire time. You know, we all know about the revolution and stuff like that. But let me cover a couple of things that are wrong with the island in order to address what we were talking about. Right now, I was just told this yesterday in a conversation with somebody who's an expert in the supply chains for hospitals in Florida and in the country. Puerto Rico is one of the main manufacturing points for big pharma for the world. And their manufacturing industry is devastated. And now there is a shortage of supplies in the United States. I was talking to somebody who understands the supply chain for HCA, which is as big as it gets in our hospital chain, for example. That is big. Now, the question is why isn't Big Pharma helping? Because they obviously have the money. Well, they can always move their manufacturing somewhere else and look for another tax break like they get there. You know, they don't have to worry about any of this, unfortunately, and their workers, of course, still have all those problems. That's a big deal. When it comes to solving the infrastructure problem, I'm driving through Ceiba in the mountain part. You're familiar with Ceiba. So Ceiba is on the coast of the island. Beautiful place. It's right where Roosevelt Roads is, which is a United States naval base that used to be there. I'm ex-Navy. That's where I learned logistics, for example. So I understand what Rosie Roads is about. So I went to Ceiba, and I took a long trip to the mountains. Started at one side, went all the way through. There is no way that any kind of centralized installation is going to happen. The entire mountain region is without power. The lines are on the ground. There's nobody up there unless they got a generator. There's no way that that's getting fixed anytime soon in a centralized grid-type way. So something has to happen in a micro fashion in order for it to work because they just don't have it. To answer your question about response, disaster response, yeah, we have disaster response. FEMA is supposed to be doing it properly. They are trained to do it. They have been a problem in my disaster history. It's not like a presidential thing or a party thing. I am totally anti-partisan. I hate them all. I just want you to know that. Okay? Let's be clear here. And this is the only reason why anything's being done successfully over there is hard work by people who care about whether they're for the government or not. It has nothing to do with pot. If one side was better than the other, then when they were in power, it would be fixed. That's how I look at it. And as far as FEMA's lunacy, I left my house the first day of Harvey And I dealt with FEMA and we had local sheriffs chase them away from us while we were trying to rescue people. You know, they put people in the field that don't know what they're doing from their office so they can man it instead of going to the private sector or somewhere else and getting expert. I mean, they could go to the Navy and get experts in logistics or whatever. So the nonprofit world was what it was all about. So they just didn't step up, and they'll use the excuse, well, they were overstepping because there was 3 in a row. Yeah, I went to all 3 of them. I totally get it. But if they need the resources, go get it. You know, and you were talking about disaster capitalism. The other side of this is that they just did a bill. There's an organization called Power for Puerto Rico that's dealing with this in the state of Florida. They just did a bill where they give aid to Texas, California, Florida, Puerto Rico. Now, we all know politics, we all know voting, we all know the Electoral College. Which one doesn't mean anything in that dynamic, going back to the statehood thing. There's no stake in it, so they get the last of it, but they have the most damage of all the possibilities. It's literally a circular craziness, and I don't see how or my organization or the people I work with doesn't see how this is going to work unless the communities, it's decentralized. PREPA has a debt. PREPA's not going anywhere. They can privatize whatever they want. PREPA has such a big debt, they can't go anywhere.
Robert, and I'm sorry, I don't have a working microphone, but Robert, could you tell us what PREPA is?
Oh, I'm sorry. PREPA is the electrical company that wasn't doing their job and that continues not to do their job forever. And I'll tell you a very evil story about PREPA and this disaster when you talk about bad things that happen. The country of Venezuela sent 2 million gallons of fuel as a donation to Puerto Rico. And the government told them that they can't take it, they have to give it to PREPA so PREPA can sell it back to the government. Now, are you kidding me? And that's why I say as advocates, we can't allow those things to continue. I don't care where it is, but it's a human thing for me. But you can't allow those things to happen with the government stopping aid coming to the people. It's lunacy for that to happen. And why? A hospital in Castañeda was, on their own dime, was flying, helicoptering in fuel for their community so people would have fuel because they had no way of getting in there and nobody was helping them. No government, Puerto Rico, federal, doesn't matter. They turned away FPL. In disasters, our states have contracts with adjoining states. You've all seen social media. When Sandy happened, you saw the pictures of or even Irma, utility trucks coming from other states. Puerto Rico told FPL no. That's the partner. They were ready to go over. They told them no. Somebody explain to me why? I don't know.